Everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from our hometown scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Today's story, Joe Graham, story number 2. Hello there. We're speaking of old-timer Joe Graham last evening when we closed the scrapbook, and tonight we'll take up that story of one of the harbor's most colorful old-timers and follow him on into the scattering of small buildings that greeted him yesterday. With A.J. West, his wife and family, and a small group of employees who had followed the pioneer army captain from Michigan to man his new sawmill on Grays Harbor, saw their new homes for the first time. The year was 1884, Sunday, June 8th to be exact. For 12 days the travelers had been en route, first across the plains and mountains by railroad, then the portage from Elwaco north across Shoalwater Bay, up the beach to North Cove, and on the little stern wheel steamer Governor Newell for their last lap from Westport. There had been a stop at Hoquiam then, as the little steamer thrust its bow into the brown waters of the Wishkah, and they saw the town called Aberdeen, where A.J. West was building a mill. But before we begin our second chapter in the story of Joe Graham, let's ask Dick Crombie for a few words for our sponsor. As Joe Graham remembered his first look at Aberdeen, it was a settlement of 6 buildings, a scattering of houses, and a cannery. That was all. The cannery was a barn-like Hume packing plant structure on the riverbank at the end of what is now State Street. One of the buildings was the Aberdeen House, the town's only hotel, clutching the riverbank like a wily animal, with at least half of its wooden floor hanging over the river supported on pilings. There was a small dock to serve as boat landing and a narrow plank sidewalk that wandered inland from the Aberdeen House and off in the direction of Wishkah Street, where 4 other buildings were standing. Standing as the lone structure on the north side of Heron Street, beyond the hotel, was the general store of Adolphus Payette. It was so new that its handsome French-Canadian owner had not yet been able to put his merchandise on the shelf, and it was being pawed over by his 3-year-old son Ed, who would someday direct the county's force of law and order in tracking down a desperado, John Tornow. There was one other building, a saloon operated by Ed Clark and Leon Emmett, a house under construction, the J.M. Stout House, Joe was to learn. Its foundation stood in the block now called by Grays Harbor people the Zelasco Park. Until the house was started, it had been the old orchard of Samuel Bent's original claim. The town had been platted only 4 months before and given its name, and the stakes that had been driven here and there by David Fleet, the young surveyor, aided by George Ben, the son of the landowner, were visible at some points, half concealed by bunch grass and bush. None of the streets were cleared, but muddy sled trails wound between the stumps, cross-rutted by cow paths. There was barely a dozen men in sight, and no women, as the Governor Newell put its nose against the float and thrashed to a stop. The sun was beating down from the clear blue sky. The air was filled with the fragrance that was new to the travelers. It was fresh wood, fresh yellow fir, tide mud, swamp grass, and salt, all blending into a pungency they were to become familiar with as typical for Grays Harbor. Joe Graham looked up from the deck of the Governor Newell at the first citizens who had turned out to meet the travelers. They were J.C. Fairchild, who owned the Aberdeen House, Sam Ben, the stocky, rugged-looking man who would someday be revered as the town's patriarch founder. Austin I. Fox was there. He was a carpenter who was working on some of the new buildings. George Weatherwax, a black-bearded, broad-shouldered man who frowned formidably and chomped on his eating tobacco. All of the townsfolk had been ready at hand when it came time to carry the travelers' luggage ashore. The West party finished its dinner aboard the Governor Newell, then followed Fairchild ashore. As the hotel man took the party in hand, he had a room for Captain West, his wife and child, and might be able to take care of Mrs. John Lewis and her small son, John Young, and his wife Ellen, but he wasn't sure that he could find space for the bachelors. They waited on the dock a full hour before the hostelry bustled out announcing that he could handle them all. Then in a file, the party entered the hotel. The Aberdeen House was a notable accomplishment in the middle of the early frontier wilderness. It was still in the process of being made habitable as the party filed in. They flattened against the wall of the hallway to make room for a pair of paper hangers on the way out of with their brushes and paste pots and rolls of paper. Joe Graham recalls that one of them was E.L. Collier, later to operate one of the town's pioneer drugstores. Where the rest of the party disappeared, Joe did not know. But Fairchild ushered him into a frugal room on the west side of the building, so freshly papered that Joe could smell the paste, and with the dark smears of the stuff still drying on the wall. It was furnished with a cot, a single chair, and a rough spruce table. E.B. Warner was paired off to bunk with Joe, and after they had gingerly examined their new room, they threw open the window and Warner looked out. Lighting his pipe, he surveyed the fringe of scrub spruce that thickened as it backed away from the clearing and turned dense and dark green as it mixed with the firs and hemlocks of the hills behind the town, where Bel Air residents now looked down on their town. "It cost me $90 to get here," Warner mused. "I've got 75. If I had 15 more, I'd take the next boat back to Michigan." Joe Graham laughed, then figured that he could stand about 5 years of it before he wanted to see Michigan again. Warner wanted to bet Joe that he'd be back in the Midwest states within 12 months. There was a little indecision on Joe's part, but that made him refuse to bet. But it would have been a safe bet. He was to see nearly 60 years on Grays Harbor before he was through. A year before the party disembarked from the Governor Newell, Captain A.J. West had come west to locate a mill site. He had founded one on the banks of the Skagit River and was about ready to start reconstruction when he stumbled onto a copy of the Chehalis County Vidette published in Montesano. It contained Sam Ben's ad of new cities soon to be started. The Chicago of the West, Sam had dubbed it. The glowing picture that he painted of the new Grays Harbor community had brought West down to see for himself. He changed his mind about where to locate his mill, and that change affected the lives of many people and had a lot to do with the town that was now called Aberdeen. West surveyed the timberland surrounding the harbor and was satisfied that there was no finer timber country in America. He picked out a mill site on the east bank of the Wishkah River. The radio station now occupies that site, left instructions for the start of construction, and went east to finish his cutting of his timber in the Michigan mill. It is said that he had hardly cut the last shingle bolt in his Ardmore, Michigan plant, and the machines had scarcely slowed down than the workmen were taking the belts off the machineries, unbolting the equipment to ship it west. Almost before the bearings had cooled, his machines were loaded onto flat cars for their way to Portland, halfway across the continent from the little Michigan town. Joe Graham was one of West's mill hands in the East. He was a close friend of the ex-Union Army captain's son, Arnie, and close friend to the West family. Joe had wanted to come west to Washington ever since he was 18. Now he was offered a job in the new country with his friends. And the day after he arrived, he was at work helping with the construction of the new Aberdeen plant. First, there was a trip to Cosmopolis with West and one of the workers to shop for tools at the Nims and Stockton store, the best place in the county for general merchandise. There was a cross-cut saw to buy, axes, shovels, grub hose, and a few other tools. Then they hurried downstream in a borrowed boat, and Joe turned the first shovel full of earth for the sawmill in Aberdeen. The next day, still timbers began to arrive from the sawmills in Cosmopolis, and a crew went to work to get the mill up and ready for the machinery that should not be far behind. With Tom Manley, Joe cut the dock pilings and capped them and laid the deckings, which had been cut up in Cosmopolis. They were not too soon with their building, for within 10 days the little schooner Gypsy slid against the dock and began unloading pulleys, boilers, stacks, guy wires, saws, and tons of other materials that would go into Aberdeen's first sawmill. A crew from Hoquiam had to drive the pilings. Joe recalled them as Joe Carnahan, the engineer, Jack Snyder, the deckhand, Bob Durney, another deckhand, and Al Coon, foreman. It was the hottest day of the summer when the crew raised the stack of the new mill, and in July the plant cut its first board. The mill was as yet without a roof or walls, but the machinery was set up with the idea of sawing their own material for those important parts of the structure. And the first logs, a thick-budded spruce, had been felled when the site was cleared, went into the carriage and was fed into the saw while the sawdust flew and the town listened for the whine across the river as history was made at the first sawmill went to work in Aberdeen. It was about that time that John Lewis came down from Bellingham to find his wife and small son, and somehow John forgot to go back. And when the mill went to work, John had a job as a setter. His family was added to the growing list of families that called Aberdeen home. When the mill began operations, owner West had no problem with logs. He had a pretty good stock that had been cut off the mill site. Then he began to use those that had been floated down the streams, the Wishkon Chehalis by ranchers. Then came rafts of cedar up from the Voorhees place at Markham, and other logs from Henry Beaver, who was logging over on Preacher Slough above Cosmopolis, and Alex Polson and Ike Wood, who were logging the bluff along what is now Aberdeen's east entrance. On the dock, the freshly cut timbers began to grow and stack in piles, and soon it was being floated across the river for new buildings that were being planned in Aberdeen, west of Wishkon. Hardly a week went by, Joe recalled, without some newcomer arriving in town with plans for a new building, or someone laying the foundation for an addition to a growing cluster of wooden structures. Now right here, we'd like to ask Dick to step in again for a few words from our sponsor. Yes, as Joe often recalled, Aberdeen was growing fast in the summer of 1884 when he first set foot in its uncleared streets and the coming of the first sawmill. A.J. West's mill from Edmore, Michigan spurred things along. In the months that followed, the mill became one of the main influences in the town. Sawdust from its busy saws went to fill the swampy streets, and planks sawed on its carriage made new sidewalks, docks, and landings. Until the mill went up, any lumber for building had to come down from Cosmopolis or up from Hoquiam. That took time and slowed things a bit for the folks who wanted to get a roof over their heads before the autumn rain started. During the first years, the mills cut lumber for boarding houses and bunkhouses that was to house the mill crew as well as the West family. And it began to build up a backlog of the first cargo of lumber ever shipped from Aberdeen on the schooner Charles Hanson, and the carriage of the mill provided a romantic ride for a pair of newlyweds, young David Fleet, the surveyor from Montesano, who had staked out Sam Ben's town, married the Waite girl, whose family operated a general merchandise store on the banks of the Chehalis. They came down to Aberdeen on their honeymoon, and the crew of the mill talked them into riding the long carriage back and forth a few times as their honeymoon trip. Joe Graham recalled that they were game for fun, and though they climbed off the carriage teetering and breathless, they were smiling. That's as far as we can go with Joe Graham tonight, but we'll be back tomorrow night with one more story from our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.